Good morning and welcome to History's Half Hour HHH, where we're going slightly out of the chronological we've been dealing with because of the reality of today, or the week which we're leading up to, which will be Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, and is most famous or infamous for being a day of fasting and memory of destructions of the temples and other events which have taken place. But the question we're going to be asking today is more to do with the issue of whether the destruction of the temple or temples was it actually good for Jewish survival? And although that may at first seem to be a rather bizarre question, let us just look at it further. Now, one of the places I want to start is with a classic question, which is asked by Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, who in the year 1899 penned in his famous essay concerning the Jews, which he described this particular question as being the gem in the ocean. And he concludes this article to do with the Jews in a famous way, which leads us into many different questions and is something which has been debated, well, in the modern period. Says he, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other people have sprung up, and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jew, however, he says, saw them all, beat them all in one particular sense, and is now what he has always been, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. Goes, he says, all things are mortal, but the Jew, all other forces pass, but he remains. Thus and therefore, what is the secret of his immortality? Now, there are a number of questions to be asked from this particular passage, which are worthy of consideration, but we should consider that Mark Twain was not the only person to have asked this sort of question about the survival of the Jews, which seems somehow bizarre in the reality of world history. Surely they should have just disappeared. Winston Churchill, on a similar theme, but not exactly the same, illustrated his discussion, his debate on this topic in the Sunday Herald of the 8th of February, 1920. Says he, again, this thing of this immortality of the Jews, he says, the Jews are the most remarkable race. Some people like Jews and others do not. But no thoughtful man can doubt the fact that they are beyond all question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world. And if you think that only he and only Mark Twain asked this question, there are numerous people, and another one would be Tolstoy in the early 20th century. They go to Russia's literary giant, continued in the same vein. Now, the question which Mark Twain is putting forward, or the statement he is putting forward, is that the Egyptians were there, the Babylonians were there, the Persians were there, the Greeks and the Romans were all there, and they simply disappeared, but we Jews have continued on. And in one sense, if you are to state that he is alluding in entirety to empires, then it is true. None of these empires, the Egyptian Empire, the great Babylonian Empire, the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans were all great empires and all have disappeared. But the Jews, in whichever form they are today, continue on, and that has to be somewhat remarkable. Others would argue and argue along and against maybe Jonathan Sacks, who put this forward quite often in his argumentation about survival of the Jews. That if, on the other hand, we are alluding to the Babylonian people, the Egyptian people, the Persian people, the Greeks and the Romans, not just the empire, but the people themselves, well, in some sense, they are still here. There are, we know, Egyptians. The Babylonians are the Iraq, if you could say, Iranians. The Persians are the Iranians, and the Greeks, well, are the Greeks, and the Romans are the Italians. And all of them are still here in one sense. And the Jews are not the same as they were some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So whilst they have, in a sense, disappeared, they have changed, metamorphosed, and are still existing as those other nations are as well. But there is more historical nuance to that, and it is something worth considering that we have to look at. So let us examine history and the topic, therefore, that the destruction of the temple was and is good for Jewish survival. That somehow that happening allowed the Jews to continue on in the way that they still do to this day. Now, in the land of Israel, up to some, say, let us say 3,000 years ago, the days of Solomon and David, there were eventually, after the destruction of or the death of Solomon, there were two countries, a division, and we now have Judah and Israel. And they were ruled by kings, good, bad, indifferent. The states were small and insignificant, and they existed and expanded, as would be argued by B. Arley in Power and Palace. That's a very good book. And they would exist and expand and develop and be successful as long as the surrounding empires allow them to be strong and to exist and be successful. Because if the empires surrounding them were weak, then the empires in Israel, not an empire, then the countries in Israel would be strong. But if the empires surrounding them were strong, then the countries of Israel would be weak. Now, the country of Israel and Judah would be at their greatest expanse during the period of the reign of King Solomon and later Jeroboam II, who was around the 8th century before the Common Era. The kingdom of Israel rebelled against Assyria. Despite any good advice that this in general was not a good thing for some tiny little states, as the land of Israel was on the Levant, a tiny area, to rebel against an enormous empire was not generally a particularly good thing. And in the year 722 BCE, before the Common Era, that kingdom of Israel, as a result of rebellion, fell to mighty Assyria. And its people, marred in idolatry and insignificance in many ways, became, as we would know, the 10 lost tribes. And they would enter into the mythology and the fable and the fiction of history, more or less to this very day. But the 10 lost tribes, as they became known, those 10 tribes of Israel seem to have had no philosophy of survival, no means of continuation, so that it simply disappeared. And due to the particular foreign policy of Assyria, they did population swaps. The kingdom of Israel's people were taken off into Assyria, and many Assyrians were then dumped into what was the land of Israel. And some of the mixture would become, due to this population exchange, the Samaritans. So the kingdom of Israel disappeared. It wasn't unique. What are the Ammonites and the Jebusites and the Moabites and all of those that are mentioned so often in the Bible that simply have disappeared out of history? Nobody speaks of the Jebusites and the Moabites and the Ammonites and Hittites and the others today. They all disappeared. It would seem that they were too small and insignificant, surrounded by larger nations. And like Israel, they were swallowed up and spat out. And they would have a god often that would be a god that was a local god of their particular city or country. And when their city or country was destroyed, their god, as it were, was destroyed as well. So they had nowhere to go. The people literally disappeared. There was no survival strategy. Yet, hundreds and hundreds of years later, more than 1,000 years later, in history, after the rise of Islam, there was another religion which was imperiled. Now, during the Persian period, Zoroastrianism, which would have a great influence on the theology and the philosophy and also the prayer modes of the Jewish people, were Zoroastrians. They were the most populous religion on earth, then between 20 and 30 million people. The land was, as a result of the enormous expanse, development, and conquering power of Islam, they would completely, or more or less completely, disappear. So that today it is considered around 150,000 adherents of that religion. It would seem that Zoroastrianism had no survival technique. Exactly the same as the other nations which we mentioned, this religion fell into that as well. Without some form of survival technique, they disappeared, more or less, from history. So going back to Mark Twain, so what is the difference, therefore, between the Ammonites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and the Moabites and the Zoroastrians, and what do we have? What do the Jews have? What is the secret of their immortality that they all disappeared and we continued on? Now, Judah hung on with its temple, as we know. The land was divided after Solomon, Israel and Judah. Israel's now been carried off to the Assyrians, and Judah continues with its center being in Jerusalem, with its temple, its high priest, and a sacrificial, more or less like a cult. And eventually, it too rebelled against its mighty neighbor of Babylon. And despite the admonition, despite the advice of prophets well known in the Bible of Ezekiel or Jeremiah, that they shouldn't rebel against mighty Babylon, that no good will come of it, eventually they did. And in the end, they were destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE. And a large number were taken off to Babylon. How much of the temple was destroyed or not destroyed is open to academic debate. How many were carried away? Again, it's open to academic debate. But even more, it was seen, were left in Judah. There was a remnant still there in the land around Jerusalem at that time. And the prophets then saw this destruction of the temple as being something profoundly terrible and something to be memorialized, and they instituted the fast days of. There were no names to the months, therefore it was the 9th of the 4th month, the 9th of the 5th month, the 3rd of the 7th month, and the 10th of the 10th month. And all these would have names later on. But fast days did not dictate the agenda. By this time, the people who went down into Babylon and developed under prophets such as Ezra and Nehemiah within Babylon had a legacy. They knew of democratic monarchy, but they had great literature. The Bible is magnificent. It is walking poetry in many ways. It is something substantial that is given to the world and still exists to this very day, thousands of years on. People still look to, record, remember, dictate, and read out this great literature which made up the Bible. And the religion was monotheistic. Now, some would say henotheistic, and henotheistic would be where you have one God, but you accepted there were others. But let us say that we are talking monotheism. This is an idea of a God that is movable, world encompassing, there for all peoples at all times in all places. It is not contingent on whether your city is being destroyed or your country is disappearing. Wherever you would go, God would be with you. So even if you had your country being destroyed in one area, it didn't affect what was going on somewhere else. Now there was therefore what was left as a result of this idea of great literature, of monotheism, of democratic monarchy, was if something was there which was a supreme contribution to humanity and to all the three Abrahamic faiths later on. Those in Babylon nurtured and passed on a belief that then the temple would be rebuilt, and that Israel would spread the message of one God, and that even without a state, this message would be there, and Messianism, the idea of the coming of a Messiah, would also be developed. The second temple was rebuilt after 70 years, and exactly as was predicted. For nigh on 700 years, the state of Judah, that's the remaining section of these two states that existed as one before or until the time of the death of King Solomon, the state of Judah existed, unstable as it was, under the whim of great powers. As we mentioned, the Greeks and the Romans, great powers, which meant that the state of Judah hardly ever existed as such. But it was, this tiny little state was a temple-based, sacrifice-centered state with unreliable kings and with corrupt high priests. But it was centered on this cult of the temple and sacrifices. Eventually, if the Jewish world, or then the world prior to when they were known necessarily the Jews, that Rome would defeat Judah in the year 70, and the temple, and the sacrifices, and the high priests were gone. But Judah and the Jews was not land dependent, not temple dependent. We were not like those tiny little countries which existed in all places. So that even you can destroy the temple, you can destroy our high priesthood, you can destroy everything to do with came about as a result of having a temple and a high priesthood. Judaic God would be with us and travel everywhere. So that the temple-based religion would have made, had it just been about the temple, had we believed in a God which existed just in the land of Judah and would exist only as long as the temple stood, we would have disappeared like all others, like other simple little nations that disappeared at that time. But the loss of the temple allowed what had already been developed all the time from Babylon, from 500 years before the Common Era, all the way to the year 70. So now we are talking 500, 600, 700 years. But the loss of the temple allowed the religion of Judaism to flourish everywhere and anywhere. Yes, observe a few fast days, and we should note here that now eventually the fast would have names, and the fast of the fourth month, Nisan of Tammuz, was moved from the 9th of the month to the 17th of the month. So whilst everybody always says it's the 17th of the month of Tammuz, originally it was the 9th of the month, but it got moved in order to bring about what is commonly known as the 3 weeks. But see how, as an example, how rabbinic Judaism flourished. It took hold of a concept, it took hold of an idea, and it developed into something which was user-friendly. Had we been like all other ancient states, we truly would have disappeared. So we have to ask the question, therefore, so was the destruction of the temple good for Jewish survival? Thank you very much.